Good morning. This is Omar Muhammad, and this is our 36 minutes on antisemitism. Today's guest is a special guest from Israel, Tal-Or Cohen Montemayor. Tal-Or, welcome on our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Tal-Or Cohen Montemayor. I'm the founder and CEO of Cyberwell. Cyberwell is the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism launched in May 2022. We monitor anti-Semitism online across the major social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and what was once known as Twitter, today X. We monitor online anti-Semitism in English and in Arabic, and we act as a trusted partner for the social media platforms, sending them real-time alerts that empower them to enforce and improve their own digital policies and share the data that we collect with efforts fighting hate.
It's a massive work because online space is becoming more difficult every day. I ask this question every time I invite a speaker, because I believe it's very important to work within definitions in order to tackle a problem. So the question is, what is the definition of antisemitism?
So the standard definition of anti-Semitism that Cyberwell uses and actually applies to our discourse analysis on our data is the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition of anti-Semitism, which generally defines anti-Semitism as a certain manifestation or perception of Jews that can be expressed as hatred towards Jews, rhetorically, physically, online, that's directed to Jews or non-Jews typically perceived as Jews or standing with Jews. And then the IHRA working definition goes into 11 real types of anti-Semitism that can be broadly defined as 4 categories. So one is classic anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, Holocaust hate speech or denial and trivialization, and Israel-based anti-Semitism. These are, broadly speaking, historically, the different types of anti-Semitism that we'll see. But I would say, in addition, in my own personal and professional addition to that, I would say that anti-Semitism is a Jew-phobic conspiracy theory that can take many forms and fuel not only hatred and violence towards Jews, but hostility towards Jews. What's unique about anti-Semitism is that it is so nuanced. It has changed its manifestations over time. But one thing that remains true is that it is absolutely based on this scapegoat conspiracy theory for a certain group being responsible for the troubles of the world.
You monitor anti-Semitism online, Tal-Or. What is the current state of anti-Semitism online?
So the current state of anti-Semitism online, especially post-October 7th, we've seen an explosion of anti-Semitism online and specifically calls to violence against Jews and Israelis. Following the Hamas attacks on October 7th in Israel, we saw an 86% increase in online anti-Semitism overall, so nearly a doubling. And we saw a very clear shift, specifically in our Arabic anti-Semitism database, of an increase of 61% in calls to violence against Jews and Israelis. I could also add some additional color to the state of online anti-Semitism prior to October 7th, if we look more generally at 2023, which I think is valuable. One of the things that I can say that was a positive kind of change in 2023, and I think a lot of the statistics that we're seeing are as a result of, again, an increase in online anti-Semitism in recent months, is that the average rate of removal for reported anti-Semitism increased from 20 to 25% to about 32%. By social media platforms in terms of removal of that online anti-Semitism. While that's an improvement, obviously much more needs to be done. And I can also share with you that what we've noticed about each platform is that they host a different type of anti-Semitic narrative. So when we look at Facebook and Instagram, which are Meta's platforms, we see that the number one leading anti-Semitic tropes are that Jews control the world or are dominating the world order, In Instagram, it's the Rothschild conspiracy theory as the banking ruling family of the world. On TikTok and on X, the number one anti-Semitic trope is that Jews are the enemy, which is very interesting to notice about these specific platforms. Jews are the enemy is a very tribalist, you could argue, concept, maybe even rooted in a religious anti-Semitism. And on YouTube, we also see another form of religious anti-Semitism, which is saying that Jews are the synagogue of Satan. That's a concept that's taken from the New Testament as a criticism of Jews who rejected Jesus Christ and has been today used by many fraction extreme religious groups to say that the Jews are in a satanic cult of sorts.
Take us, Tal-Or, to October 7th. And I would like you to show us the situation of the surge of anti-Semitism on the day of October 7th and the days that followed.
Sure. So on October 7th, I say because I experienced this myself, October 7th was the largest hijacking of major social media platforms by a terrorist group. That terrorist group is Hamas, and their expressed mission is a genocidal anti-Semitic mission, which is to eradicate and kill Jews. And we saw the manifestation of that mission realized during the Hamas vicious attacks on October 7th. And for the first time, we saw a large-scale hijacking of our social media platforms, live streaming to people's personal Facebook accounts, executions of families, kidnappings of families, parading women naked in the streets after being recently raped and murdered. And then you also saw the reaction to that content, the celebration of that content, a real bloodlust and the celebration, or I say pornographization, of the death of Jews at mass scales. This triggered, among other things, two things. One, as we mentioned before, a very clear increase in calls to violence against Jews, specifically in online anti-Semitism in Arabic. In the Middle East, we saw a very clear affinity or new romanticization and heroification of Hitler, specifically. Hashtag Hitler was right, increased by about 29,000% on X alone, on Twitter alone, in Arabic. And we see this also in the keyword statistics that we are tracking at Cyberwell, that Hitler, in terms of the use of the term of Hitler, just as a figure, went up precipitously. Another thing that we saw very clearly, in addition to these disturbing calls to violence following October 7th and the weeks following, was the beginning of a new form of Holocaust denial, the October 7th denial campaign. And I want to say very clearly, especially to somebody who's a researcher in anti-Semitism and studies anti-Semitism, that October 7th and the Holocaust were two distinct historical events. They shouldn't be conflated. But what connects October 7th denial and Holocaust denial that we saw explode on social media in the weeks following is the anti-Semitic framework of which this conspiracy theory brings people. Every station of anti-Semitic belief is packed into the denial narrative. So if I could explain what I mean by that. We saw as early as October 8th, 10th, and 11th that certain accounts started tweeting out misinformation and disinformation that are part of an October 7th denial narrative. The number one narrative that we see online today, even 6 months after the October 7th attacks, is that rape and sexual violence didn't occur. That's about 38% of the narrative. 36% say that Israel was actually behind the October 7th attacks, that they were purposefully triggering this event and even killing their own people. And finally, anywhere between 5 to 10% of the narrative says that Israel is gaining some kind of financial benefit from the October 7th attack. So what does this do? When you say October 7th never happened, it's all a conspiracy theory or it's all a hoax, what you're essentially saying is a couple of things. One, the fact that Jews died and were killed in mass doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. So trivialization of Jewish life and, more importantly, Jewish death. Two, you're saying that it's a lie. So all of the Jews are lying. And then somebody says, okay, well, if they're all lying, how is it possible that everyone's talking about this? Well, everyone's talking about this because the Jews or the Zionist faction are controlling the world. And they want you to talk about this lie because they are getting money from this. So you have just affirmed a bunch of anti-Semitic tropes, that the Jews are liars, that they control the world, and that they're motivated only by money. And what's deeply concerning to me, and I think this is true about anti-Semitism online in general, sometimes the most toxic and violent, triggering forms of anti-Semitism are actually the conspiracy theories, including denial. And we're seeing a real failure on the part of the social media platforms, despite the fact that they have policies that prevent violent event denial, right? Holocaust denial, that's prohibited content. In fact, it's one of the most effectively enforced forms of anti-Semitism. It's very difficult to find Holocaust denial online because the policy is so clear. Same thing with the Rwandan genocide. Same thing with the Sandy Hook school shooting. All of that is prohibited content. But as Cyberwall is monitoring the unprecedented traction the October 7th denial campaign is getting online, the rates of removal by the social media platforms are at a little lower than 9%, so much less than the average. And more importantly, the traction, the exposure that the October 7th denial campaign is getting is pretty significant. In a vetted data set of about 313 examples of vetted, meaning we manually went through this content and vetted it, we saw that small data set got over 25 million views over the course of just a couple of weeks. That's a lot of views for such a small data set. And it's indicating to us that the algorithm is picking up on this type of conspiracy theory, reinforcing it and broadcasting it to millions of people. And the danger with that, if I could just add one last thing, is that in a denial narrative, it's not about what happens at the event. It's about what will happen afterwards in terms of the delegitimization, but more importantly, the reinforcement and normalization of attacking Jews. We will meet the damaging effects of the October 7th denial campaign later on, not necessarily right now. And I also want to say that we're in a very difficult time when we look ahead to 2024 because we're coming up on an election year. I believe at the moment, when we're looking at the unprecedented rise in violent anti-Semitism against Jewish communities, we're kind of seeing it coming from the radical left or radical Islamic groups that are now targeting Jews in their homes and in their businesses, not unlike what you saw during Kristallnacht. But that's right now, and it's very much connected to the conflict. As we move into an election year, I think we're going to see white supremacists in the right wing take advantage of the open hostility that's been triggered by online anti-Semitism, coming up with their own conspiracy theories and perpetuating a wave of anti-Semitism from the right.
At Cyberwell, you do not only monitor, but you also study the behavior of this online culture of anti-Semitism. It has become a culture on its own, where groups can all agree on one thing, which is anti-Semitism. The right wing, the extreme left, Islamists, neo-Nazis, they all have found a common ground. So how would you describe that behavior online? And what encouraged it?
And what? I'm sorry?
What encouraged this behavior?
So it's definitely dangerous to see that the anti-Semitism or scapegoating the Jew and hating the Jew, attacking the Jew has become a unifying factor for such radical ideologies. We're seeing that also in ideas exchange in terms of misinformation and conspiracy theories between the radical left and Islamists to now right wing. We saw this actually happen very early on before the current culture of online anti-Semitism with David Duke, who was the former head of the KKK, embracing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That was kind of the first step of the white supremacists saying, departing from this concept, at least in the United States, that all Jews should leave the country and go to Israel. And now they're saying, no, Israel is an expression of Jewish supremacy worldwide, and we have to adopt radical left and Islamic ideas and activities in order to just beat back the Jew, destroy him. Okay, that Israel has now become a representative of the worldwide Jewish conspiracy theory. So what is leading and triggering this? Aside from the fact that we still are living in online spaces and we're participating in online spaces that have algorithms that are meant to draw our attention to extreme content to conspiratory content. So it means that people who are in these online spaces are also now getting more followers as a result of this. You can look at Jackson Hinkle as a great example of somebody from the right who had a couple 100,000 followers. And then when he started post October 7th, tweeting out a lot of conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism coming from the Islamic groups in the left, shot up to now millions of followers. And that's just following October 7th. It was a very clear pivot in terms of the narrative and the content that he was sharing. So we can see that anecdotally with different figures on the right now using more anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and ideas and gaining more traction and more following as a result of it. There's also an exchange of believers, right? An exchange of followers within that idea migration movement. What triggered this? Really great question. So it depends on how far back you go, obviously. I think one thing that's very clear to anybody in this space who's looking at misinformation, disinformation, and extremism is also the appearance and the intervention of bot farms, of foreign-backed campaigns that are taking divisive conspiratory ideas that often lead to anti-Semitism and retweeting and putting that information out there for the masses. In the October 7th denial deep dive that we did, we've done 2 reports on that. I encourage listeners to go and look at that at cyberworld.org/reports. All of our data is transparent and useful, so please use it. What we saw is that we had certain accounts in Lebanon with only a few thousand followers tweeting out October 7th denial very early and getting millions of views. So that also indicates to us that there's some kind of inauthentic exploitation of the social media platforms. So there's a lot of inauthentic exploitation of social media platforms. In general, the polars of the radical Islam, radical left, and radical right have now, as you said, convened on this concept of anti-Semitism. They're participating in idea sharing. They're participating in follower exchange. But if you take a step back, the reason that I started Cyberwell is because I saw, when I was an anti-Semitism researcher myself, a very clear migration of hardcore anti-Semitism, hardcore anti-Semitic belief and conspiracy from the hate channels, the kind of darker platforms, onto our everyday social media platforms. And that happens often through the visual platforms, specifically YouTube, people who are investing in creating a lot of content that is connected to conspiracy theories. We saw this also with QAnon. QAnon jumped from 4chan to the mainstream social media platforms via YouTube, right? At the time, there was a whole deplatforming of Parler that became kind of the scapegoat among big tech. But YouTube was the #1 social media platform that was cited by January 6th insurrectionists as where they got their information from. So the same thing can be said about anti-Semitism. There was a migration in the last 10 years from the hate channels that were kind of dedicated to chat rooms onto the mainstream social media platforms. And the difference of the mainstream social media platform is its market share, right? Over half of the worldwide internet activity, 4 billion people, are using the mainstream social media platforms. They're not using the hate channels. But because of the problem of enforcement and improvement of the digital policies and the lack of investment on the part of the social media platforms very proactively to enforce their own policies around these issues, that has led to hate gaining a much larger audience than it had at the beginning of social media.
You have already talked about how this has evolved, but if we go deeper into the question of the similarities and differences, and also how anti-Semitism has evolved online, looking back at the last 10-15 years, what do you see?
So part of it is the migration that I described from hate channels kind of being siloed onto the mainstream social media platforms. Another thing that I would say that is very recent is that anti-Semites and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and specifically anti-Semites, when they first got onto major social media platforms, first of all, there was some effort to deplatform them. When Musk came in and took over X, he kind of threw out the rule book on content moderation. And for the first time, you had someone who blurred the lines between a mainstream social media platform and a hate channel. And we're still seeing the elevated levels of anti-Semitism and hate on X as a result of the decision to re-platform people who are very much affiliated with hate ideologies. So that's one thing that triggered a flashpoint of online anti-Semitism in major social media platforms. But the other thing is, as these ideas and these circles of anti-Semites have been in their own echo chamber on the platform, and now we have a flashpoint with the current war in Gaza after the October 7th attacks, the conspiracy theories are now legitimate fodder or legitimate fuel to target Jews online. Jews online today, what I mean by that is that anti-Semitism online has migrated or has evolved from just being promoting conspiracy theories and hardcore hate to now actively targeting Jews. And that happened on Twitter, by the way, before Musk was on the platform, with the whole incident around targeting Jewish journalists specifically, right? If you remember that with the whole brackets around the name thing. So that happened on Twitter, but it's now happening on Facebook and now happening on Instagram and TikTok. It is now legitimate to target and harass Jews online. The online spaces are the number one place where an average Jew is likely to experience anti-Semitism. AJC just put out their State of Online Anti-Semitism report, and over 60% of Jews are likely to experience online anti-Semitism. And I do want to share another thing with your listeners, is despite the headlines around TikTok or Twitter, or every platform has its own issue, the number one place that Jews experience anti-Semitism online is actually on Facebook, which is something that's very surprising to people. Also, in Cyberwell's data, we saw that the highest increase from a percentage perspective of anti-Semitism following October 7th was actually on Facebook, was 193% increase, right? So each platform, and that's another thing when we think about solving these things, is each platform has its own vulnerabilities when it comes to the level of anti-Semitism and how that's playing out.
I think it's important because when we talk about tech companies, I don't believe they are doing enough. But there are organizations or companies like Cyberwell that are trying to do something. I think it's important that our listeners learn more about Cyberwell. What are you doing? What is the mechanism you are following? What are the successes, the challenges that you face, especially when reporting anti-Semitic contents?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So one of the added values of Cyberwell, aside from just monitoring this content online for data and research purposes, is that we're actually analyzing how each policy is failing to be enforced. So in that sense, Cyberwell is an online anti-Semitism compliance solution. So from our data in 2023, when we think online anti-Semitism, most often people think of hate speech. But actually, our online anti-Semitism policy analysis shows that 61% of online anti-Semitism is dehumanizing and stereotypical content, so hate speech, but 17% is violent content, graphic content, calls to violence, and 15% is false information. So I think that that's also very important to understand, is this is the level of clarity that we, Cyberwell, are providing to the social media platforms. I'm not just coming to have an education conversation about what is anti-Semitism. Maybe you didn't know about the Khazar conspiracy theory, right? Or the synagogue of Satan, which often is very esoteric in the eyes of somebody who works in policy at a social media platform. Rather, I'm coming and saying, I have very clear data for you on how your own policies are failing to be enforced. And I'm not only showing you how they're failing to be enforced, but I come to you actively with sharing data, verified data sets, and also keywords and queries on how I got to that data so that your engineers can go ahead and remove that content at scale. To give you a story about how this works, ahead of October 7th, I had a very positive moment. We were in a partnership with TikTok, and I presented our partnership at the Eradicate Hate Global Summit in Pittsburgh, where we showed a use case of finding an interview with a Rabbi Finkelstein, obviously not a fake rabbi, but in this interview, the fake rabbi was sharing the secrets of how Jewish people have their money. And he explained that they take unwanted infants from hospitals, they kill them, and they use their blood for ritual purposes, and then turn around and sell the bodies of the infants to McDonald's for hamburger meat. Okay. And when we flagged this for TikTok, they had no idea that this interview was on their platform. We had found an initial 14 videos, so a very small data set, and it had reached about 1.6 million views at the time. But because we did the legwork for them, I don't assume that they're going to solve the problem. Actually, we've seen they're not going to solve the problem, but I do want to equip them with solutions. We showed them all of the lowest common denominator points, the interview itself, the hashtags, the accounts that were spreading this. The engineers at TikTok were able to go in independently and then find an additional 60 videos of this content, remove that content at scale, and put the interview in something called an auto detection bank, which would prevent the interview from ever coming back to the platform, which would effectively prevent millions and millions of views in the future, but more importantly, would create a more compliant platform. And that's the goal of Cyberwall, is to create platforms that have compliant solutions to address online anti-Semitism.
So you have a clear understanding of the policies. You are doing great job trying to inform the giant tech companies who have the big responsibility to do something. But when we talk to them, they say we are trying to do what we can. So the question is, what should they do more?
I think that there's a lot to say about what they should do more, but I think that we also have to get to a certain reckoning point when it comes to legislation around this issue, because there's a lot that they could do in terms of investment of their own resources to have preventative technologies and not just be in this situation where they're reacting, right? If we go back to this flashpoint again of October 7th, it really exposed how the vulnerabilities of the social media platforms can be leveraged by a terrorist group to promote terror psychologically through the applications far beyond the point of time and space of the actual attack. That should have been a major wake-up call for democracies everywhere under the threat of terrorist attacks. Why? Because they could do it to your population too, right? They held the Israeli population in a severe state of terror for weeks after the attack, and also the Jewish community in the larger world, in the different diaspora communities. It can happen again, and in fact, it did. The weekend afterwards, in Sudan, there was the execution of about 700 to 800 Christians by an Islamic group, and it was immediately streamed onto Facebook. It's like, why? Because they're learning from Hamas, right? So it exposed that the social media platforms have built-in vulnerabilities. They are being leveraged by foreign actors, by terrorist organizations. That is a national security threat. And I think now in the United States, with the passing of the recent bill that forces the sale of TikTok from its Chinese parent company, there's kind of a recognition on the part of the legislator, like, okay, unbridled operations of social media platforms, they do have some checks and balances. And then the question becomes, how do you get the social media platforms to invest in these appropriate preventative technologies to take the data that actually surged on their platforms in the weeks following October 7th to learn from that data in order for that content never to come back to the platform. So there are a couple ways to address this. In the EU, they just recently passed, or it came into effect, rather, I should say, the Digital Services Act, which empowers the EU to fine major social media platforms and big tech search engines like Google about 6%, about up to 6% of global turnover if they fail to remove illegal hate speech. So then you say, okay, well, in the United States, there is no such thing as illegal hate speech. And you'd be correct. But I think that the United States has to come to an understanding socially and legally that free speech is not the same thing as paid speech. And it's a very important thing to understand. On these social media platforms, you are participating in paid speech. This is a private company that's algorithmically enhanced and being paid by advertiser dollars to sell you things. It is not the same thing as free speech, or to put it differently, the constitutional rights of the Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, were constitutional rights. They were supposed to be able to have their march, right? But there's no constitutional right that says as a Nazi, you get to march in Disneyland. Why? Because it's private property, and it's because also it's a public space that's meant for families. If we look at the user demographics of these major social media platforms, this is a public space that has very young users on it. It's being used in an everyday way. And more importantly, it is a private company. So I think that the United States needs to take the recent momentum that was built up around the TikTok bill and needs to apply it in an industry way, in an industry-wide way. The other way you can approach this, if you don't want to approach it from a national security perspective, or maybe it's a yes and situation, if we look at any other highly regulated industry, one of the first things that is put in steps as control is transparency. So if you look at food and drug development, you have the FDA. The FDA has a set of requirements that you have to prove that you have ethically developed this drug in order for it to be brought out to the public. Why is there no similar algorithmic administration to show basic ethical testing of your algorithms or your hate speech lexicons, for example? That's one way to approach it. The other heavily regulated industry is the banking industry with the SEC and the market exchange transparency requirements. Again, if you can't solve the problem immediately, you can start with transparency. We should have transparent data on how much data on social media platforms is considered toxic content and how much resources, how many resources, meaning money, is being invested by the social media platforms in order to combat this issue. Since the Frances Haugen testimony, the Facebook whistleblower, all we know is that the resources that are being invested in combating toxic content that includes hate, that includes misinformation and disinformation, that includes psychologically damaging information is minuscule, very, very little resources of the platforms. So even if the government doesn't want to step in and regulate your speech, was as an American, I can completely respect. Maybe there needs to be a minimum amount of money and resources that are going to actively fight this type of toxic content online. And an example in real estate, in New York, if you're a big developer and you put up a massive apartment building, you must invest in low-income public housing and parks. It's an exchange. So that level of transparency, that level of making legal requirements for social investment in the platforms simply doesn't exist today in the United States, and it absolutely should.
Moving away from the online space, how has all this, the failure of policies, the hateful anti-Semitic online contents, how has all of this impacted the daily life of Jewish communities in real life?
Yeah. I think I know that, as I mentioned to you, online spaces have become the most hostile environment for Jews to be present on. It's the number one place that they will be experiencing anti-Semitism in their day-to-day life. And for the over 60% of Jews that experience online anti-Semitism, about 22% of them experience or report experiencing a threat of physical safety when they experience that online anti-Semitism. There were earlier surveys done amongst college students that say that online anti-Semitism or being targeted by hate for their Jewish identity has even caused them to go into stress-induced anxiety, lose sleep, fall into depression. Okay, so it's very much affecting the Jewish community on a very personal level. What we're seeing is also that Jews, because of the experience of online anti-Semitism, are now actively hiding their Jewish identity, both online and offline. About 1 in 4 Jews, once they experience online anti-Semitism, will then take steps to hide their identity, which we know historically is simply an indication that the anti-Semitism level has gotten very high and is intolerable. It is not safe for Jewish communities and to be a Jew. And a lot of the experience and that perception of feeling unsafe is coming from the online spaces. And it is then being echoed and reinforced, and I would say in some cases even triggered by targeted attacks against Jews and Jews in their communities. We are now looking at a situation in the United States where there is a 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents, according to the ADL, in the last year. And when I say that, I want to put some more color on that. It's not just a number. Recently in California, there were people who went into a Jewish neighborhood in Beverly Hills and bear sprayed and pepper sprayed Jews on their way home from work. That is not acceptable. And by the way, that is not being, it's not coming from an esoteric conspiracy theory. That's being very much from the explosion of content that's very anti-Israel and often leads into anti-Semitism. You asked earlier about how has anti-Semitism changed? It's not only changed in the sense that it is now targeting Jews online very aggressively personally, but there are clear calls to action. There are calls to mobilization that come with these surges in anti-Semitism. And that's something that's very unique to online anti-Semitism right now.
In 40 seconds, Tal-Or, the concerns about AI, the artificial intelligence.
I think that AI and generative AI produces a host of concerns and risks, but also a lot of opportunity. So on a risk factor, we can see very clearly also in the anti-Semitism online post-October 7th, a new utilization of creating visual tools, meaning pictures and video, but primarily pictures, to promote anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, but also hostility against Jews. And that is one of the primary concerns is we know that bot farms already exist. Imagine if those same farms are now equipped with a machine that can just put out content that is hate-filled content and even content that's wiser, that can make assumptions or really identify which conspiracy theory or which image is going to mobilize somebody to act. So that's probably the major risk. But in terms of opportunities, like I said, the data that already exploded online, the rise in online anti-Semitism, all of this data can be learned from using generative AI tools. And if our focus shifts to the AI platforms, we can create an industry standard of an LLM or a large language model that does not validate online anti-Semitism. And that's what CyberWar's focus is going to be in 2024.
Tal-Or, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Amar.
This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.